Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti alla casa italiana Zerilli-Marimò per la presentazione del libro Dressing Style, Writing Fashion in Early Modern Italy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Eugenia Paulicelli back to the casa to present her book. We put this book presentation as a part of the series that Eugenia created for us along with Grazia D'Annunzio, A Dressing Style. And this also gives me a chance to thank Eugenia for what she has done for the Casa for the past 3 years already, creating interesting, innovative, and thought-provoking events related to the culture of style, fashion, architecture, photography, and whatnot. And finally, we have a chance to celebrate Eugenia's own accomplishment by presenting her book here tonight. Along with Eugenia, there are two distinguished colleagues present tonight. The first one to speak is going to be Bella Mirabella, who is an associate professor of literature humanities in the Gallatin School here at New York University. She specializes in Renaissance studies with a focus on drama, theater, performance, and gender. She's the editor of the book Ornamentalism, the Art of Renaissance Accessories, and the co-editor of Left Politics and the Literary Profession. She has written articles on women performance and sexual politics in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. After Bella, we're going to have Virginia Cox, who is the chair of the Department of Italian Studies here at New York University, so our own department. The interests of Virginia concentrate on 16th century Italian literature and intellectual history, early modern women's writing, the history of rhetoric, both in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. Her most recent books include The Prodigious Muse, Women's Writing in Counter-Reformation Italy, with Johns Hopkins University Press, 2011, and Women's Writing in Italy, 1400-1650, always for Johns Hopkins University Press, in 2008. And before we invite Bella to come to the podium, I would also like to tell you something more about Eugenia Paulicelli. Eugenia is a professor of Italian literature. She teaches at Queen's College and at the Graduate Center. Her main interests are fashion and cinema, and the book that we are presenting today deals with the Renaissance, but Eugenia is also a specialist of the contemporary period, and her previous book on fascism has been received with great critical interest by colleagues and scholars. I don't want to say much more because I think we are here to listen to our speakers, and I would like to invite Bella to come to the podium and start the discussion. Thank you.
Good evening. I just want to begin by saying that Eugenia has given us an excellent book, a book that brings together a collection of crucial writings that can only enrich our grasp of the origins of fashion and continue to prompt us to think about the many compelling issues that she's raised, such as gender, which is my focus tonight. Inspired by Eugenia's book, I would like to offer some observations about women and dress. One of the issues that Eugenia covers is the tension that exists between men and women and how the practice of wearing clothing and negotiating fashion reveals the gender politics of the Renaissance. In order to think more about this, I want to begin my remarks tonight by thinking about an iconic item of clothing that Eugenia has written about in a book that I edited on accessories, and also what she refers to in this current text, and that is the veil. Reading Eugenia's text has encouraged me to recall two poems. I'd like to begin with Dante and Petrarch, which make use of the veil, and which set out some key ideas about fashion and women. Both of these poems are, of course, directed to their beloveds, Beatrice and Laura. In Dante's poem from La Vita Nuova, written in the 1200s, he is in a deep, turbulent dream. And in the poem, love, personified as a young man, arrives carrying in his arms a sleeping Beatrice, who then, by the time she gets to Dante, awakens, and love gives to Beatrice Dante's heart, which she then proceeds to eat. It is a rather astonishing moment, probably in all of literary history, and certainly for our purposes noteworthy, because Beatrice is wrapped in un drappo, or a veil. In the mid-1300s, Petrarch follows Dante with a poem in his Canzoniere, in which he laments that Laura has chosen to veil her face now, that love has made her aware of Petrarch's desires. The veil, by concealing and blocking, as he writes, the lovely gaze of Laura's eyes, not only becomes a device that controls the poet, as he writes, but now that he is denied the beloved's gaze, he says that he certainly faces death. In both of these passionate poems, the veil is a compelling accessory, one that can conceal or reveal the feminine beloved, an accessory that is a symbol of both male desire and female modesty. As such, it is a complex item of clothing, one that, as Eugenia has noted, can signify chastity or seduction. These two literary examples reflect the tension around how women dressed and how men viewed them. Both of these writers, both of the male desire of Dante and Petrarch and the wish to possess their beloved is mediated through the veil. For Dante, it is the erotic image of a veiled and alluring Beatrice who devours him. And whether the veil is transparent or not, the reality is that Beatrice's body is just so close, just within touch of Dante. Of reach to Dante. For Petrarch, his desire to possess Laura and the beauty of her face and penetrating eyes through the power of his gaze is thwarted by the veil. These are both arresting and erotic images with multiple meanings, such as the idea that female beauty is, of course, bound up with male desire. We can recall how powerful female beauty is if we remember Castiglione's warning that much is lacking to a woman who lacks beauty. In this instance, it's clear that being beautiful is necessary for a woman who is the object of the male gaze. But it can also be profoundly disturbing to the man who feels the need to master that beauty so that he does not lose control. In both the Dante and Petrarch poems, the men are not in control. They are subject to their desire for Laura and Beatrice's bodies concealed under the veils. Eugenia reminds us of this conflict when she quotes from Giacomo Lenteri's Della Economica, who, speaking through the voice of a female, to female readers, advises that unmarried women need to dress modestly, preferably completely covering their faces with a black veil. Such a fashion style is constructed purely, it seems, for the benefit of the men, as Lanteri continues, who can remain tranquil if the women are veiled, thus able to govern a well-ruled city, as long as they are protected from lascivious thoughts provoked by the female body, a provocation that can only lead to, as he writes, effeminacy, softness, and most dangerously, to a loss of the virility of both their bodies and their souls. What this example makes very clear to me is that how women were dressed had the power to weaken men, robbing them of their identities, and in a way turning them into women. Women then were expected to dress in order to protect and control men who were apparently unable to do this on their own. But women were also paradoxically required to please men. Recall Castiglione's delight over the unexpected glimpse of a bit of ankle as a woman is walking along, or the taking off and putting on of gloves that reveals female flesh. This seems a complicated affair then. Women had to be beautiful and alluring in order to please men, but at the same time they had to be careful to negotiate Castiglione's difficult mean so as not to be too desirable to endanger men. Hence, women and how they dressed had to be regulated, and this is where the sumptuary laws that Eugenia also discusses come in. And whether they were seriously enforced or not, these laws were essentially leveled at women. Of course, women were continuously advised to self-regulate as well, to dress modestly to protect their virtue. Writers from Christine de Pizan to Juan Luis Vives reiterated that idea. As Vives says, modesty and chastity have been entrusted to women. In many ways, then, it seems that women are both the protectors of men and the moral guardians of virtue. Both of these ideas appear to upend expected male roles. Further, they seem to counter the standard idea that women are the source of temptation and corruption. One thing is clear, I guess, trying to regulate women became a huge task for men, but it had the benefit of being a perpetual turn-on as well. It keeps men in a constant state of desire that must be controlled by the virtuous and chaste women, the very object of their desire. In this complex system of male desire and regulation with regard to dress, as well as the sometimes contradictory nature of clothing, what can we say about female agency, autonomy, and creativity? In Dante's poem, the veiled Beatrice, although a construct of the poet's imagination and desires, nonetheless has power over the desiring lover who is at her mercy. In Petrarch's poem, whether true or not, Laura has taken an action to protect herself and her honor and to keep her free of the poet's gaze. This action of Laura's seemed to point to the fact that women were certainly savvy about the relationship between beauty and virtue. When Lucrezia Marinelli writes that it is necessary for a woman to be beautifully attired and ornamented because such a look is a comment on her, as she writes, natural dignity and excellence. When she says this, she makes it clear that women understood the power of clothing and accessories to help them construct an image of refinement, good taste, and most particularly virtue. We see this idea repeated by other female writers such as Moderata Fonte and Arcangela Tarabotti, who understood that the desire to dress well, in Tarabotti's words, were parallel to a woman's right to an education and an intellectual life. In fact, the veil comes up in Tarabotti's life that Eugenia deals with as well, since she was forced to, by her father, to become a nun. Tarabotti decries her father's veiled deceit. This action, she says, along with that of the state of Venice, which abuses girls, forcing them to enter the convent against their wills and therefore to take the veil. In this instance, the veil becomes a symbol of deceit and a loss of freedom for women. But Tarabotti, by making and selling lace, which is what she also did, uses clothing, fashion, and her own writing to fashion herself as a woman of action who overcomes the veil by not only establishing a literary career, but by participating in commerce as well, even within the confines of the convent. Despite the sumptuary laws, misogynistic attitudes, and the deceitful behavior of many men, it seems clear that women wanted to be appreciated for their moral beauty as well as their abilities to recognize true humanist values through writing as well as control over what they wore. There is another story of the veil that Eugenia recalls, and that is the story of Tullia d'Aragona, the poet and writer who was called to the Florentine magistrate's court for not complying with a 1546 law that ordered courtesans to wear a yellow veil or a handkerchief as a sign of identification. D'Aragona fought the law in which, in part with the help of Eleonora of Toledo, who herself is worth mentioning as a fashion trendsetter and as an icon of grace and virtue, and who seems to be the epitome of Castiglione's desired Sprezzatura. It was Eleonora's husband, Duke Cosimo of Florence, who released d'Aragona from the law because he wrote Faceli gratia per poetessa. She was a poet, and in the words of the ruling signori, because of her rare knowledge of poetry and philosophy. D'Aragona clearly understood the power of clothing. The yellow veil, confining her reputation to that of a courtesan, would obliterate her reputation as a writer and an intellect. Thus, she had to defeat the yellow accessory and insist upon her identity as a writer. Each of these females and their associations with the veil, even from Beatrice, who is the most compromised of the figures, reveal, I would suggest, a kind of power in opposition to the men who seemingly run the show. From Laura choosing to cover herself to d'Aragona refusing to take the veil, albeit in a very different way than Tarabotti, and Tarabotti's grace and elegance in her defiance over the convent, even to writing a satire defending the right of women to be fashionable, her anti-Satire. Women were central figures of fashion in Renaissance Italy. They are at the heart of the conflict over male control and desire, which is fired in many ways by the way women are dressed. Women were at the heart of the debate about morality and corruption, which is one reason why so many books Eugenia considers pay so much attention to female fashion, whether as instigators for regulation and control, whether as moral arbiters whose job it was to curtail male desire, whether as an inspiration for clothing design or as fashion innovators themselves. Women who wrote about attire. Italian fashion could not have existed without women and without female desire for beauty and virtue, and their deep understanding of Giovanni della Casa's notion that to dress well and have fine manners, which is what fine attire represented, was the practical and visible way to attain nobility and to be welcomed within a coveted circle of acceptability and good manners, which he calls the benevolence of others with whom we live. Thank you.
So I'm the lightweight of this company. Bella has published on fashion history, but I'm just a general Renaissance person. I was very happy, though, to be invited to participate in this book launch and to be given an excuse to sit down and read Eugenia's book immediately. I was planning to do it anyway. It's been on my list ever since I first heard she was writing on the subject, but it's kind of difficult to find any time in the middle of the teaching semester for anything that doesn't have an immediate deadline attached to it. So it was very good to have an excuse for an accelerated reading. So I very much enjoyed plunging into this book. It's the latest in a series of books that in the last 15 years or so have helped open up the world of Italian Renaissance dress and fashion as a stimulating new subfield of cultural historical studies, capable of interesting far more than the specialist costume historians who tended to work on this subject area until quite recently. I'm showing just a little rather arbitrary and unscientific bibliography on the topic, just to give you some sense of the kind of shape of the field. These are just books that have interested me. So these books, taken together, have supplied both important new historical research in this area and also, maybe more importantly, new theoretical insights and methodologies and approaches, raise new questions. So these books deal mainly where Italy is concerned. A couple of them, the Jones and Stalibras and the collection that Bella edited, are much wider. They deal with Europe as a whole. But insofar as they discuss Italy, these works tend to cover the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. One very novel thing about Eugenia's book, in a very welcome way, is that it extends the chronological range of these inquiries down to the 17th century, which she shows to have been a especially rich period in the history of fashion. This 17th century part of the book was the one that contained the most real discoveries for me. I was especially intrigued to read about the fashion writer whom Eugenia credits with having introduced the word moda, fashion, in its current sense, Agostino Lampugnani, who I didn't know at all, and whose treatise La Carrozza da Nolo occupies one of the later chapters in the book. Rather unexpectedly, and this confirms my feeling that the Baroque period in Italian literature is just the most surprising and unexpected, Lampugnani, this acute observer of fashion, turns out to be a Benedictine monk. Just as the other great observer of fashion in this period foregrounded in the book Arcangela Taravotti, who Bella was talking about, is a Benedictine nun. I mean, what are the chances of that, frankly? So I suppose I was going to, structure this paper as 3 questions in a way to Eugenia, but maybe I'll add a 4th. What was it with Benedictines in this period? So yeah, generally, it's an extremely rich book, and it's very thought-provoking, and like all such books, it left me with all kinds of questions. So I thought I would profit from having Eugenia here to raise 3 kind of talking points. But I don't really want to put her on the spot. These can be, optional talking points for our discussion. My first question really would be about periodization. I mean, I think this book, along with the other ones that I've listed here, does help to prove beyond dispute that past scholarly narratives that saw the fashion system as purely a product of the post-industrial age were mistaken. There's definitely something that very closely resembles fashion as we know it today, already as a kind of cultural dynamic in 16th century Italy, long before the word moda was fashioned. There's even, in fact, quite a rich fashion vocabulary in place well before the first use of the term in the 1640s. And I couldn't resist looking up, this is one of my favorite diversions online, John Florio's fabulous 1611 English-Italian dictionary to see how Florio would talk about fashion. I've given you a little more than you need here because I couldn't resist including the words fogaccia and fogacciare at the top of the list, but you really want to start here. So yeah, foggia, any kind of fashion, guise, manner, form, or new invention, namely in clothes and apparel, so really quite specialised, though of course foggia can mean fashion more generally. Foggiare, I like that, to fashion, to follow fashions, to invent new forms or fashions. Foggiatamente, which I think could really do with being reintroduced, according unto fashion or fashionably. And a foggiatore, a follower, inventor, or a fashioner, inventor, or follower of new fashions. Fantastic. So yeah, it seems a real conceptual advance that we can now kind of talk quite confidently about fashion in the 16th century. But this did raise for me the question of periodization. People who work on 16th century fashion tend to kind of start from the 16th century and often use Castiglione in his book of the Courtier as a starting point. And I suppose that is really the first generally known book that has a kind of acute and insightful and self-conscious discussion of fashion. But I was doing some reading this summer and came across a book from the 1460s, which is a kind of book of the courtier for merchants, written by the Dalmatian merchant Benedetto Cotrugli. And I was quite struck, he has a long chapter on how merchants should dress, and I was quite struck by how similar to some of what Castiglione says, some of what Cotrugli is saying, 70 years earlier is. And this book wasn't published at the time, so I'm not suggesting it was influential, but it does seem to sort of push the discourse of fashion a bit further back. And Susan Mosher Stewart's book, Gilding the Market, Luxury and Fashion in 14th Century Florence, makes the case that in Florence, at any rate, you know, you've got the beginnings of the fashion system already in Dante's day, so that when he has his ancestor, his great-great-great-grandfather, Cacciaguida in Paradiso, kind of carping away about modern dress styles and how extravagant they are and how people used to dress more soberly in the good old days and so on. That is marking, you know, the beginning of this development that most of us kind of register later on, 200 years later on. So I suppose that would be my first question, you know, what is it that really happens during the period under discussion in this book, the 16th and 17th century? You know, is there some kind of qualitative or quantitative advance in either the empirical fashion industry or in social and cultural understandings about fashion? And I wondered whether it's maybe that the increased circulation of visual and verbal discourses on fashion enabled by print culture, which is something you talk about a lot, whether that brings about, you know, a true revolution in Europeans' understanding of clothing, relationship with clothing, or are we looking at a kind of gradual incremental escalation of a process that had its roots much further back? So my second question would be, I suppose, how far down the social hierarchy did this extreme fashion consciousness that we can see very clearly at the top of the social hierarchy, how far down does it descend? Some of the most striking passages and images in Eugenia's book are discussions of or illustrations of the dress of the upper ranks of artisans who, according to these late 16th century costume books, seem to, and to lots of kind of moral writings at the time, seem to have dressed extraordinarily richly and sumptuously. It's very surprising when you read these discussions of, you know, artisans in Venice going around wearing, you know, silks and lace and fans and these ridiculous high platform heels they went in for and so on, so that they're they're entirely mistakable for aristocrats, and this causes all kinds of social anxieties and so on. And I suppose Eugenia's book is very much focused on discourses of fashion. So, you know, it's the issue never enormously arose within the book itself of, you know, how far this motif of the sumptuous artisan actually reflects reality. But I did find myself wondering, you know, whether there's archival evidence that cashes out the fact that these people did actually own these fabulous wardrobes. I was thinking of Carol Collier-Frick's book. There's a fascinating passage in that book when she's looking at portraits and artistic representations of fashion, and she's actually sometimes able to match up these portraits with family records and inventories of what these people actually owned in terms of clothes. And she tends to find that there isn't actually much correspondence, and that the way in which people are portrayed as dressing doesn't particularly correspond to how they probably dressed at all. Her conclusion is, we see just what the Florentines wanted us to see. And I found myself wondering whether that's the case with these Venetian artisan swells. I mean, one possibility I found myself wondering about is, you know, clearly these artisans who are dressing so well are from the upper ranks of artisan culture. I wonder, were they possibly just like professionals of the luxury trades? Were they tailors and glove makers and hat makers and so on, walking around like a sort of walking advertisement of their wares? Is it this particular subclass of artisans who are dressing like that? And this author I was talking about earlier, the merchant author Cotrugli, made me wonder about that, because he actually warns merchants who dress extravagantly and go in for, he's very disapproving of certain kinds of sleeves, which he thinks are completely outrageous. He says, if you dress like this, you would-be sober merchant, people will think you a venditore di veste da donna, so a seller of women's clothes. So he clearly sees sellers of women's clothes as particularly, you know, fashionably and sumptuously and inappropriately dressed. And yeah, so it set off all kinds of curiosities in my mind. And that brings me on to my final question, which is, I suppose, does the increasing importance of the fashion system in this period bring about an enhancement in the status of the artists of that trade, and particularly the tailor? And I think partly because there's an exhibition of Giambattista Moroni, one of my favourite artists in London at the moment, which I'm dying to see. This image immediately came to my mind, this supposed portrait of a tailor, presumably in Bergamo, Moroni's hometown, who seems a very good example of this upper artisan dressed above his rank. He's wearing these quite magnificent clothes. And this is an image I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. I've been doing lots of thinking about the status of skilled artisans in 16th century Italy generally. And I find one thing that's very interesting about this image is the kind of parallel Moroni seems to be creating between himself as portraitist and the tailor as artist of another kind, that they're both kind of co-conspirators in making the aristocracy of Bergamo look good. You need them both in a way to produce the desired effect. And so I'm wondering, since, you know, from the 15th century onwards, one of the great kind of socio-cultural stories in Italy is the gradual rise in status of painters and sculptors, precisely as a result of, you know, the high market value that their products have and the increased kind of market value given to artistic skill and novelty. Are you getting the same happening with tailors in this period? I mean, one interesting thing about this image seems to be that it seems to be trying to capture the moment of design or disegno, which painters and tailors and all artists have in common. You know, you've got the tailor with his uncannily clear work surface, not a needle or a piece of thread in sight. All he's got are his scissors and then this piece of black cloth, and he's just kind of, this is the mental moment before he begins, you know, capturing his fashion design in any kind of material sense. And one detail that someone pointed out who criticised this, which I really like, is that the painting rather brilliantly kind of puts the viewer in the position of a potential customer who's presumably being sized up for whatever garment is going to be produced. So I think, you know, the end product, the Platonic ideal in the tailor's mind, has to be read as something like this, one of Moroni's very fine finished products. So I think that makes it very complex and interesting, and I found it interesting that one of the earliest treatises on the art of tailoring, written by a tailor, Giovanni Pennacchini, on the nobility and antiquity of tailors, written in 1650, places geometry right at the centre of the tailor's art, just as art theorists like Alberti and Fiera della Francesca in the 15th century placed geometry and perspective right at the heart of the painter's art. This is how you elevate your trade into a liberal art. And in fact, Leonardo Fioravanti, writing in the 1560s, is already talking about disegno as the fundamental art of tailoring. So yeah, having been thinking about this sort of stuff over the summer, I was dying to see what I could find out about tailors in Eugenia's book, and I did find some interesting material I was very grateful for, but I was kind of left with a certain curiosity. I mean, at one point, Eugenia mentions that by comparison with armourers, some of whom, like the famous Negroli family of Milan, became complete celebrities and would sign their work, tailors remained relatively anonymous in this period. And I'm sure that's true on the whole, but I wonder whether we could kind of probe a little more, whether there was some kind of emergence of, you know, the prototype for the figure of the designer or couturier in this period. I mean, certainly Fioravanti names and discusses with great admiration two tailors, one in Venice and one in Treviso, and they're given this quite kind of prominent public praise. And I was struck by the fact that one of my absolute favourite documents that Eugenia cites in this book is a marvellous letter from Castiglione written to his long-suffering mother in 1504. His mother is like his wardrobe mistress. He's constantly writing to her, sort of demanding luxury clothing items at very short notice because he's got some kind of, important diplomatic event on, and he absolutely needs this thing. One of his more desperate letters, in fact, there are two letters in close succession, and the second one is genuinely desperate, is when he needs this doublet, very fine one in black velvet and damask, because his previous kind of riding clothes are in a terrible state, and he's got to accompany the Duke of Urbino down to Rome and so on. He's terrified that he's going to bring shame on himself and his family and so on. So he writes this letter to his mother, and he asks for whether it might be possible to send his tailor in Mantua, Maestro Antonio, down to Urbino to make this garment for him. And he also says if he can't do it, just send down the cloth, but ask Maestro Antonio whether he still has the paper patterns for that doublet he cut for me before, for the sleeves for it, the doublet I wore when I went down to Naples. And clearly they're tailors in Urbino, and yet Maestro Antonio can do things that, no normal tailor can make. And it really seems as though he's talking about design skills there rather than craft or execution skills. And he uses this wonderful phrase. He says, Maestro Antonio must come down if he possibly can, because he's the person who understands la mia fantasia best. And so it's kind of design skills, but also this ability to, capture a man's style and personality and translate that style and personality into the appropriate clothing. It's very close to the art of the portraitist when you think about it. So this made me wonder, was there some faint foreshadowing of the figure of the designer in 16th century Italy? Did men in Mantua walk around on their evening passeggiata saying, look at him with his new Maestro Antonio? Those were my questions.
Thank you very much for the questions, and I will try. Yes, I have to. Yes. Thank you so much for this evening. Thank you to Stefano for organizing this, and also for your very insightful comments. Okay, let me say a couple of things from the start. It took a long time to work on this book, the research and the writing. And my main focus when I all started this project were two things. One thing was connected to the idea of the notion and relationship between fashion and nation. What does it mean? That fashion can project a certain identity, not only a personal identity, but also of people, of a certain geographic space. One thing. Secondly, I was also interested, because at that time I was doing my book about fascism, Italian fascism, and I found a lot of important references also in during the magazines. Is this idealized idea of the Renaissance as a sort of a golden age, where everything, takes the origin of the splendor and our identity and so forth. And especially for style, because of course, fascists, they look about Romanitas, that kind of period.
Third, the other thing that I was also interested, because I was designing courses on this new discipline or new area of studies, of fashion studies, theory of fashion, understanding fashion as a system, as a process, a system of meaning, and also a process of communication and in manufacturing industry, and also a great symbolic force. And I found that there were a lot of publications discussing these issues of, fashion, understanding fashion and its relationship with the idea of change. So fashion exists. We can identify fashion if there is a change in the costume, in a certain style. So there is Zimmel, there was a philosopher writing towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, who wanted to understand fashion. He looked at the post-industrial, and Virginia, in fact, was talking about that and this idea of periodization, which I'll go in a minute. So a lot of other critical books where we're discussing fashion and the emergence of fashion as a social institution of modernity, and linked it to especially the 19th century, or the post-industrial 18th century onwards, and then the explosion of the Industrial Revolution, factories and the reproduction and so forth, the city, urban, and discussing mainly Paris. Paris, the culture of that particular period, and also the literature, because also in France, just recall a couple of things. Zola, who wrote a first novel about the department store, The Lady's Paradise, and many other. Mallarmé, who also happened to write as a journalist called La Dernière Mode, with another name. So in any case, Paris was the core for the understanding of fashion and modernity, fashion and change, fashion and identity in terms of gender identity, women and men, the dandy and so forth, but also in terms of labor and etc. But thing is, Italy has a lot to say about all this process, and this was one of the questions I started, my whole research many years ago. I'm talking about more than 10 years ago, and I really wanted to understand, first of all, what was the role of Italy in this debate and in the relation, of the can we say that fashion, and then I say, I would like to specify here, fashion as an institution of modernity, social institution, able to control, able to direct ideas about taste, beauty and style. And this is why I think has something to do with the print revolution. It's something to do with the circulation of certain ideas, not just a single writing about, dress, because of course Dante wrote about dress, but we must go even to classical antiquity, the Greeks and the Romans, there were sumptuary laws in the Romans. Yes, of course. So, and this is not... in terms of periodization, my interest was to understand when fashion becomes sort of certified by discourse, in literature especially, and the role that Italian literature, because in fact, my main focus is literature, and also the relationship between image and text in certain particular texts, because the other thing was to choose, what kind of text you want to put together in this kind of analysis. So the idea for me was not so much a question of origin, really, but it was the question when I wanted to investigate the manifestation of fashion as a concern for the state and for people, and the way, and then it started to become. But the other thing is, and then the language. I think this is important. Alberti, of course, Alberti wrote in La Famiglia specifically also on the way women should dress modestly. I mean, this idea of modesty and chastity is an old topos. But what was different, and that's why I wanted to see in my framework, I wanted to see fashion in the context of two big revolutions. One was the print revolution, and the other one was the geographical exploration, the starting to explore new world. So the idea that this connection between, an idea of Italy, and how fashion was linked to nation again, but especially to an imagined Italian nation. So that for me was absolutely key for this, for my framework, because otherwise, you can write, and in fact, took quite many years to conceptualize, the framework, because you have to, at a certain point, decide, what you focus on and what is not. So the idea, so then this revolution, the technological revolution of the print and the circulation, the reproducibility of not only text, but also images, because that's the other thing that to me is also important, is paintings. Yes, and in fact, Carole Frick-Collier, in her study, in fact, the study that Virginia was quoting on Florence and Renaissance Florence, mainly the Quattrocento, she says in the beginning of the book how fashion presents itself as sort of an epistemological impossibility, because first of all, I mean, how can you completely be certain that that particular object was worn at a particular time? So how is this, it's so often this question of narration, this question that this object is within, in the context of narrative, in the context of discourse. So, and somehow is given as a reality, but as critics, we know that we have to take it with caution. We cannot completely believe in this idea. Now, the other, so the idea of this, the printing revolution and the geographical exploration, the gradual, in fact, Vecellio is key for this, because that's why I wanted to analyze the work on Cesare Vecellio and the costumi, il libro di costumi, abiti antichi e moderni, because Vecellio is trying to map and to connect dress with geographical space. This is the way Venetian dress, this is the way people from Florence or people from Turkey and so forth. So this idea that fashion has something to do with spatializing the world, so with space. So as today, so we can say, people in Italy tend to dress in a certain way, or people in Los Angeles tend to prefer certain particular colors, whereas in New York they prefer black, and so forth. So all this idea of taste, style, beauty, they were codified in writing. So this is what is the other issue that to me was, as being also a critic, I mean, I'm interested in the writing, the fact that, and this is again, is the framework of my book, because you can write 100 books and there are different perspectives you can take, because it's a very, it's a very large field of study. And also books are going to be, other things being discovered and articulate all this kind of research and enrich this research. But to me, that was important, how in literature, what Sally Brassen-Jones called the animatedness of clothing. So that the fact that somehow, within the context of narrative and description, the dress started to move, the imagination, our imagination as they do in novels and literature. And then another thing I wanted to say, my other interest was also to put in connection two different kind of languages, the visual and the verbal. Of course, are part of fashion. Fashion is image, but is also talked about. We can see a dress, but how does that dress become fashion? How is fashionable desirable? What is it? It is also mediated, and this is what also the literature and the visual culture in the Renaissance did, with this proliferation of text talking about fashion, style, beauty, and the way you should act, the way you should cut your hair or not cut your hair, the way you should wear the corset or not, and so forth, were codified in this kind of codes of behavior, codes of rules. But at the same time, these rules were also transgressed by men and women. So there is a tension here in this particular period. It's a tension that is more so than before, because of the technological revolutions, because of this new world discussion of newness, which I think, for me, are crucial to understand fashion. Again, not just fashion, but fashion as an institution, a social institution of modernity, able to have an impact on choices, not just a style or a dress. So to me, that was very important for this particular study. Now, this is a quote from Machiavelli, from The Prince. Here is in English and in Italian, that to me also, again, the idea of tension in gender relations, in definition of gender, definition of geographic space. There is also another dynamic that fashion brings to the fore, which is being and seeming. And this one is also something that, Machiavelli says here, many people see you, right? But pochi sentono quello che tu sei, which I found particularly crucial, for this dynamic of construction of an identity, of a leader. We know today that in political campaign, we're obsessed with the idea of how the leader is dressed and all that, and the way this can be received by the crowds. So all this was really theorized and linked to political issues. That to me was the other concern. My concern, my research concern. Again, some other people can be concerned with other, but to me that is a specific concern. The other thing that to me was also important is that already we find in this period in sort of an idea of nation, as I said before, and an idea of Italian identity. They were already talking about this idea of how you know, gli italiani. Castiglione says espressly, but he's not the only one. There are many examples of this, you know, the way Italians should be, should look, and all that. So this idea of the concept of sprezzatura, to me, is a concept that is very, very complex and needs to be discussed over and over again. And I found particularly fascinating that in the blogosphere, sprezzatura is used. If you Google menswear and sprezzatura, you'll find 52,000. They talk about this word of Castiglione and apply it to men's wear, to men's elegance, so to sort of sense of style in men's clothing. So this is a pain. I'm just having some images here. I'm not going to comment, but this is some images that they are part of the books and some extra. And what I wanted to say about the images and the visual culture and research, for me, was also important to study the images, not necessarily as illustration of the literary, sometimes, but sometimes don't, but to see the images and what happened in these images, how certain items are represented. Now, the example of Venice here, this is Cesare Vecellio, and this is one of his paintings about Venice. And of course, this idea of maps and clothing, geography, what I was saying before, that to me was very important, the fact that dress was connected to space, geographical space. To study, this is the Cesare Vecellio's book that I studied for many, many years. When I started to study, then the translation came, and Rosalind Jones and Margaret Rosenthal did a wonderful translation. And it's interesting that he did 2 editions of this book. And by the way, the costume books was a European genre, not only Italian. But this is one of the best examples. And it is interesting to me to see that he made 2 editions, one in 1590 and one in 1598, and the order is different. So in the 1598, he wanted to include parts of the walls of the new wall that were not included in the previous one. But it's also interesting that, for example, in this edition, it starts from A to Z. In the beginning of the book, for example, and here he said acconciature con un velo, so headpieces with a veil for you. But the other edition start with Africana, completely different order. So to me that is also indicative. So how, you know, I wanted to do a close reading. That's the other thing. I loved, you know, I chose the text. I read many, many books, but then I wanted to concentrate in some. So that's the way I structured it, because I wanted to really read the text very, very closely. And in these cases, there were 2 editions, more than 400 pages each. So this is some of the images. For example, this image that I discuss in the book that doesn't really have not much to do with the description, because sometimes, you know, you have to read the description of the Vecellio, not really as an illustration. So it's much complicated what's going on there. But for example, this is a young Mexican. So it's so interesting that this young Mexican has a mirror that Vecellio described as a fashionable item, no? That the Spaniard brought, you know, to this new world, and this mirror is towards us, towards the reader, and whereas in the background you have this body of somebody without dress. So this dynamic within the context of the new world, the one who has been sort of following the fashion of the Western colonizers, and the other one that stayed behind. So this dynamic that you can read more in the image, not more much in the text, because he doesn't talk about it. And so forth. These are Turkish ladies. These are just some examples from Vecellio. For example, what interests me, which is also similar to what happened in the veil, in the dynamic, the rosary. So the rosary, in the description, these are Neapolitan women, but the rosary, this item, in Vecellio's description, becomes a fashionable item, not really something that has something to do with religion. So it was so fascinating to see and to read this text in a very, very close, and to see the dynamics. But that is more than that. It's what happens to the veil. It happens the same way, because the veil in the beginning was a sort of, chastity to cover something that was connected to different kind of religions. But then here becomes like a fashionable item, like for when Madonna in the 80s, right? So it's sort of interesting, this dynamic of the useful and the fashionable. So what is fashionable is not really useful. Doesn't have anything, or not necessarily. So, and this dynamic is present in this text, and that what to me was also fascinating to see. The tailor, for example, there is also a book of the Gian Giacomo del Conte. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That came out many, many years ago. That was retrieved in the Querini Stampaglia, and that's also another example that I discuss a little bit in my book, and is a sort of a catalog. So this entrepreneur, a tailor in Milan, that put together all this costume to show to his clientele. This is interesting because this is on the left is a representation in Cesare Vecellio of a Turkish soldier. And I found that this is an helmet that is actually in the museum, in the Stibert Museum in Florence. It's a great place. I studied there a few times. And look at the similarity, so of the object, the representation of the helmet and the actual object. The other thing that to me was interesting, this is from Giacomo Franco, another chapter in the book. Giacomo Franco wrote specifically on Venice, and this is some of his maps that, of course, connected with dress. But there is something else. These are some of the images that are in the books. Yes, this is the tailor. And it's also in Franco. There is a representation of also of the tailor. This is the Negroli discussed before in Virginia's talk about the armor. They were very prominent in Milan, and they actually sign their work. Nobody did, only the painter. The painter and them, not the tailors. In fact, that's why we have a hard time. Otherwise, in the letters. Yes, and these are corsets from the 16th century. And I also, yes, this is from Parmigianino, Minerva, and she's wearing a corset under the dress. And what is also interested me in the book was the hybridity of certain particular items of clothing, like the corset. On the left, these are two objects that there are both at the Stibert Museum in Florence. The one on the left is for women, and the one on the right is for men. Colletto, to wear under the armor. So the sense of, I don't know, perhaps I'll stop. I'll stop here, and then we can take some questions. But what I wanted to say is that some of the major ideas behind these studies were these issues of fashion and construction of national identity at the time when, with the creation of the vernaculars, the idea of nation, as Benedict Anderson has written, started to come to the fore. The idea of nation, the desire for a nation when vernacular languages started to form themselves with the print revolution and all that. So that to me was a specific point, not of origin, because I think fashion started even in classical antiquity. Not even, you know, I mean, really, the idea of dress, if you have to study the history of dress, you have to go back. But I was more concerned with focusing on a certain particular time when fashion was connected to this kind of tensional forces, and when Italy also lost its political hegemony. And that's the other contradiction. Paradox, and I conclude here, is that the word fashion, moda, in Italy, and we have to wait until 1648 when Lampugnani wrote his Carrozza da Nolo to find the word, the actual word. So far, I have not found any test. Florio doesn't mention it. Nobody does. So, to me, that's another interesting issue. How come Italy was exporting fashion and style, even, you know, in the medieval ages, the artisan, the Quattrocento, and so forth, and exporting culture, because although there was, you know, the political weakness of the Italian peninsula, there was still books like The Courtier, The Prince, and all, you know, Italian humanistic culture and painters were all over Europe. How come we don't have? So we have fashion in English, in French, but not in Italian. It doesn't exist. You have Foggia, La Cosa degli Abiti, they think about clothing, but not moda. Nothing. So this is another paradox that to me was also kind of interesting. But also the idea of discourse. So how this is certified by discourse, this idea that dress is an issue. But and the other thing is that to me that is also a materialization of issues of identity. So ideas are not abstract, are concrete. So that's the other idea that I had concerning considering literature as a sort of a materialization of this kind of discourse. And so 1648, La Carrozza da Nolo by Giacomo Lampugnani. For the first time you have moda, and then you have a neologism called modanti that actually I didn't know how to translate because I had to translate many of these things. I called it fashionistas or fashion victims but he talks about men especially, so that's another fascinating aspect, and the fact that the Italians are losing their sense of identity because they follow the French. They don't dress. They follow the French tailor. In fact, he has an example that all these Milanese gentlemen go to the bottega del sarto francese, and so they don't really go to the Milanese tailor and so forth. Which is again, it's so moda is there. Political hegemony is completely lost because at that time, really France and then Paris became the capital of fashion. So this is really not a joke. It was a serious political matter. There were also serious political laws, Colbert forbidding Italian imports, really big things, not just words. I mean, there were actions, political actions. And so that to me also is kind of interesting as a dynamic, as a tension. That fashion is also linked to nation, it's also linked to the idea of branding what we say today, a particular city, a particular nation. So Italy had lost that kind of power, so to speak. So I just wanted to, and also because I think there was something also masculinity going on there that was quite important, which I discuss also in the book in reference to Castiglione, but also in reference to Vecellio and Franco and Tarabotti and Lampugnani. There is a j'accuse that is also recurrent in Italian literature towards certain kind of masculinity. I'm thinking that afterwards, after Lampugnani, there is another interesting literary text, Il Giorno by Parini, another Milanese author, and he dedicates this to fashion. And the protagonist is a man who is a fashion victim, who's not able, to do political action, to change. So there is a j'accuse there, which is quite interesting, that need to be further explored. So, I don't know, I'll open to questions, and of course, thank you so much for all your points that you raised in the discussion.
When you talk about sumptuary laws, how prevalent, where they were most prevalent, and how they happened?
Yes, they happen everywhere. Do I have to use this?
Per il video.
Is it? Yes. Different cities emanated sumptuary laws, and they were connected to the idea of controlling the social body, but also class and gender, behavior and expenditure. And it was linked also to this idea of mobility of classes that could afford, lower. Not only aristocrats could afford princely attire, so the rich merchants were able to afford princely attire. So that was another way of, or also the way of controlling the part of the body and flesh that need to be exposed, for women. But for example, there are cases in Venice that scholars have studied. I give in the book an overview just to give a sense of this idea of controlling, but at the same time of transgressing, because apparently these laws were not really completely followed by the people. But also there are some examples where in Venice they just decided not to enforce the law when they had visits of kings, and they wanted to show Venice in the best kind of image. So then nobody, they could actually suspend the law. So it was, and there have been a lot of studies now. Studying also different geographical areas in Italy. There are historians who are actually focusing on the dynamics in different cities and in different. I don't know if you want to add something.
Well, one thing. This is on now. Green. Okay, there you go. One thing I would add is what you said earlier a minute ago about how it is like a social control, and that sumptuary laws were directed towards different areas of social behavior. And I said earlier that they were often directed towards women, and in one regard, the way they were, one other area that they were directed towards would be weddings, and where people would be spending a tremendous amount of money on how they were going to be dressed, and that there was a fear that young men were being bankrupted because they were going to spend so much money on a dowry or whatever it is they had to pay for it with the wedding, that they were that it was going to have enormous, this expenditure on clothing was going to have an enormous effect across all the social strata, because it was going to have economic ramifications as well. And as you said, gender, and so it was, but isn't there generally thought that they were written but not necessarily enforced? But I always think that even if they weren't, they nonetheless have an effect. And there are instances of women being brought up as kind of like, you're violating this rule, you're wearing clothes you shouldn't wear, and them trying to get around the regulations.
Also the interpretation of the law, because sometimes women change the style of the dress.
In order to like undermine the sumptuary law. They go, okay, you don't want me to wear that, well, I'll do this instead.
Yeah,
so this is a good point, yeah. How to get around it, how to subvert the law.
The interpretation.
Yeah.
Well, was it specified?
Yes,
There are clothing that you couldn't wear?
Yeah.
Yes,
In fact, there are
Can you talk
certain.
about that?
I make some examples because I just saw it. I wanted to, because for me it was important to understand the context of this dynamic of, discipline at the same time of the transgression, which is also part of fashion, right? I mean, fashion tries to be, uniform, and at the same time is this transgression. And so the sumptuary laws are a very good example of that. And so there are certain laws in which, for example, I think the Prammatica di Mantova, Cardinale, there is a text. It says, the text, that the artisans, for example, cannot wear black velvet. And of course, black velvet was one of the most expensive fabric. We see Castiglione, and also in the letter actually to the mother, he wanted that particular sumptuous cloth. Or, for example, certain signs to distinguish the Jews, the rings. There's been written about that as well. Yes. So, some distinctive marks, and also the courtesan. You talked about Tullia d'Aragona.
Right. The courtesans. I mean, it's interesting that Jews and courtesans were told to wear yellow accessories. They were both marked in yellow, wearing yellow of all different kinds. And then also, I think you alluded to this earlier when you said there was confusion. I mean, one thing around, people dressing beyond their class or out of what was determined to be their class. And courtesans were very confusing because they would be dressed fantastically. I mean, they were in many ways the height of fashion. And then, of course, this would confuse foreigners who would come into Venice and think that they were courtly ladies, and here they were courtesans. So they tried to regulate their dress in sumptuary laws by saying they couldn't wear pearls, certain things that would be the signifying sign of what a fine lady would wear, and couldn't have courtesans wear it.
Because it's, I think, Jones and Stallybrass, and great book, they talk about this idea of, they explain how really dress is an inscription of identity. So what is crumbling at this particular time is that you cannot, there's a confusion. So who is the courtesan, who is the princess? Who is the prince, who is the merchant? Who is, the modest? So that's the other thing.
Like a uniform in a way.
Exactly, but there's also the crumbling of this idea of, the church controlling. No, so that to me, my perspective, that's what interests me most, really, to try to see, to understand fashion within this kind of context of slightly, crumbling of certain values, and in the process of transformation, political, economical, social, and cultural transformation. And in this kind of chaos, so try to find, as the conduct literature, for example, or the certain treatises try to put order in the chaos. Say, okay, so then a gentleman has to act and dress and talk and like this. These are the rules of the game. Because otherwise, so this is, I think, it's sort of fascinating that fashion is part of that language. So fashion dress become a language like other kind of languages. So it's a part of a system, what we say today, what Barth will discuss much later. So it becomes, so the body becomes culturally visible because of dress, because it has this layer that somehow communicates a certain identity. So that's why, for example, Vecellio said, okay, these sleeves are Venetian sleeve, a Comeo. So, and in fact, interesting, Castiglione talks about exactly defining. He has a passage in which he talks about the Venetians dressing like that. So there is a certain distinctive tract of a particular place. And so, and that is sort of, but even for us, right, in our in reality, I mean, you need, how do you understand? How do you decode, a certain, and then there are ideas that they are complex, but it's part of that kind of layers and performance and how can I say? It's a sort of that understood. And unwritten codes, Let's say you go for a job interview and in a certain particular field, you know that you have to dress in a certain way, otherwise nobody takes you seriously. Is what Castiglione says when you go, court, please don't dress like un pagliaccio, no? Or tanti colori, or and so forth. But it's interesting, the idea of the code. It's the principle, it's not so much, but it's the idea that there is a world that is regulated by certain codes that needs to be understood, that needs to be communicated, and then you have to play the game if you understand it.
Eugenia, you know that there is this pseudo-legend that Michelangelo designed the uniform of the Swiss Guards, the guards of the Pope. And since there is a lot of discussion, especially also in what Virginia was saying about skilled craftsmen and the painter signs, the skilled craftsman doesn't. Have you ever encountered an occurrence in which a painter somehow designs a piece of clothing and takes credit for it, aside from the pseudo
Leonardo da Vinci has, I mean, there are some implications about certain pattern. For example, I found it somewhere, il nodo. And there are, but no, not evidence. No, I know there are studies about, but the identity, I mean, it's very hard. For example, Carole Frick-Collier has written on women artisans. She has written a really great essay a few years ago, but the women who were actually making these objects, hats and other things that they were working. Yes.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I think that's a really interesting question. I've never come across any kind of references to artists designing clothes, but I think the place one would want to look is these kind of great court spectacles, which are quite costumes. Well documented, especially in the later part of the 16th century, and there's so many artists involved in the design of the stage sets and so on. It would be really interesting to kind of drill down on the account books for the Medici wedding of 1589 or something like
James
that,
wrote
because there are those fantastic costumes for that, and to see A, whether they're employing court artists in that, or B, whether they that might be where I could find my kind of proto-designer Sarti or something.
There is also a designer, you talk about her, you mentioned in your book about women, Elisabetta Parasole. Actually, I mentioned in the book some, and I think Elisabetta Parasole was a designer, was a woman designer. And she wrote the Teatro delle Donne, right? And so she also was, I think, that maybe one of the first women designers who designed lace. She was actually, and so I think that's another interesting element in terms of material culture, so to speak, because in fact also Vecellio and Franco, the two authors I talked in the book, they also design lace. There are books in which they had patterns because it was a very famous. So that's another, I think, very interesting point there to be further investigated and studied, because Parasole, if I recall correctly, and you know the text better, she connects also this idea of women and designing, so making, but also writing, like the needle and the pen that has been studied also, right? So that other connection, which I think is very important.
Well, I'm just one thing about designing, like you said, when you think of someone like Eleonora of Toledo, you realize that she must have had control over how she looked in those portraits. But it seems one of the questions you encourage me to think about anyway is, when you were doing the portrait of Eleonora or whoever it might be, does that person who's paying for the portrait give you a dress and say, this is what I'm wearing? Or is the painter, and from what I understand about art history, many art historians anyway say that the painters are having this fabulous imaginary moment. They are creating incredible things. I mean, look at Botticelli's Primavera. That is a magnificent dress, which I've never seen anything else quite in any other portrait like that. Or the intricate designs, or some of the portraits of Queen Elizabeth that are with these oversized dresses and bows and pearls da morire. Someone is going crazy. And I think it's the painter, or else Elizabeth has said, really, just let's go all out here. I don't know, but something is going on with the painters, I seriously think. Yes, I think that.
It's been written also that sometimes the sitters used to leave the dress for the painter.
Yes, yes.
So then the painter could be, because the details are incredible of some, yeah.
I was, this is a really interesting discussion, I think. I think I was very struck in that letter by Castiglione by his talking about this
fantasia
who's
mia.
the only one who can interpret his fantasia. And that's talking about dress as a kind of artistic collaboration between the wearer. And I was about the person who executes, but there is a suggestion, I think, that the tailor is putting in more than simply execution, and that it's a genuine collaboration. And I was thinking how many descriptions we have of that period of very culturally ambitious noble women. I was talking about Vittoria Colonna earlier this week, and about her image and how carefully she crafts it. And we have these fabulous descriptions of how she appeared at certain wedding festivities. And she would be wearing these just like staggering clothes and accompanied by whole trains of people wearing specially designed clothes. And they've got high cultural content. They've got all kinds of emblems and mottos and kind of almost a supercharge of meaning. And clearly she has her fantasia is being expressed there, but there must be kind of some kind of collaborative system within court dress where you have, highly paid court, artists who are translating this fantasia into life.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's fascinating to look into this, more and more. I'm just thinking this idea of also that dress, is Johnson Stalibra said, is a worn world. You actually, carry that kind of complex idea about world identity and all that fantasy. But that sentence used by Castiglione, it's so, it's just so important. Also from the point of view of the construction of masculinity, because of course, the other thing that to me was very important is that, when we think of fashion, we think of women, right? So fashion, women, weaknesses, vanity, all the kind of thing that Tarabotti was crazy about, in defending, and rightly so. But then you see exactly there. And Pietro Bembo, for example, writing to Isabella d'Este, because Isabella d'Este gave her some perfumes that she actually was very good in creating perfumes, for example. So this idea of gift, but not only to women and queens, but gentlemen, courtiers. So then dress was not something that concerned women, but men. And that's another thing that to me needs to be more and more emphasized and more studied, because fashion, we cannot study the history of fashion, we have to study the gendered history of fashion, because otherwise, we will miss really the point.
But one thing that just what you just said about men and women, men seem to be, as you said, completely obsessed or interested in being fashionable, but yet the sumptuary laws are never addressed towards them. Now there is critique of the way they are dressed. Yeah, there is critique about the way men are dressed with their doublets and all of this, but there is not that I am aware of that they're actually being told, your doublets are too stuffed or whatever it might be, or too
unless
much
it was
slashing.
effeminate.
Exactly, unless it was effeminate, and then it might draw some attention. So that's fascinating when you talk about gender, that we have men very interested in fact, being fashionable, but I don't know.
In fact, I absolutely agree, and I think also in terms of this masculinity, I mean, what is interesting in Tarabotti is that, and what really makes her contemporaries completely annoyed, by her, and is that she talks explicitly about men and masculinity. It was not spoken. So that's important, because it was only the issue between dress, gender, and femininity, and vanity, and lack of intelligence, basically, was associated with women. So what she does, which I think is very revolutionary in terms of the time, and also in terms, if you look at the fashion history, is that she says, no, fashion is not a concern of women, but look at what men, how men perform themselves in public, how they, the details. She is very, very precise in this, and you look at the paintings, you see it, the details. And so she verbalizes. And you see, this is another thing of the power of discourse, the power of writing, and the power of voice, that she's sort of certified this idea that was there, but not spoken. Not.
I think Lucrezia Marinella, a little bit earlier, does some great observations like that.
Yes.
She says at one point in this treatise on the nobility and excellence of women and the defects of men, she says, men are always talking about how vain women are, but look at men, the way they walk down the street with their swords and their menacing beards. What are these if not ornaments?
And the cod pieces, yes.
I know. I was just coming back to the masculinity issue and to Castiglione. I found it very interesting as well, the follow-up letter to the letter where he talks about how he'd like to get his tailor down to Urbino and so on, when he hasn't received this cloth or this garment from his mother. And he goes into this extraordinarily heartfelt diatribe about, how oppressive the need to dress as he has to dress is. And he says at one point, I wish I'd been born in such a condition that I could have become a barber or shoemaker. And it's easy to think, disingenuous, well, I'm sure he wouldn't if he were born into that status. But it does kind of make you realise what an extraordinarily kind of, it's clearly a genuine trauma for him, this thought that he might have to be seen wearing
of not appearing the way he thought he was supposed to.
Particularly because he's at court.
Well, exactly.
And his whole job.
Diplomat.
I mean,
he dressed well.
Yeah, his whole identity is at stake here, and it makes you realise that fashion is deadly serious in that period in a way that it's kind of hard to imagine the equivalent of.
And deadly is probably a very good adjective.
I think it's
mentioned about wearing of yellow for courtesans or Jewish people. Did that extend to other cities as well, London, Paris, or was it just?
This I
I've
don't
never
know.
I've never heard of
Yellow,
that.
yes,
It
yes.
is
It's,
throughout. I do know about my research
Yeah.
in Italy, and it was various colors were worn at different times to sign, to mark Jews and courtesans. Sometimes red, sometimes green, but ultimately the color that really emerges is yellow. And other cities in Italy would indicate and mark Jews with yellow.
Well, then that came
The
forward
star,
to the 20th
also the
century.
star.
Exactly.
the
Well,
star,
that's probably where
exactly,
it
the
comes from.
star also.
Could be a
There is.
circle.
So it's a politics involved.
Oh,
Oh,
right,
absolutely.
absolutely, yes. And race and
Yeah.
yes, religion, yes, of course.
Eugenia, I wonder if your book addresses the company of the hose in Venice, the Campagna
Oh, yes.
Calze. There's
No.
a moment of extraordinary male flamboyance. It's a sort of society of enthusiasts, kind of wealthy guys, but they dress these entertainers to go out and perform these, and they would wear these very flamboyant tights. I mean, the thing that really I find fascinating about Renaissance dress in relation to masculinity and gender, which you've all been bringing up, is the way that there's been this sort of it's obviously happened gradually, but if you look at medieval and Renaissance dress, men then are dressed as beautiful young women dressed today. How did this flip occur? And is there
Well, Flugel.
Whether the literature at the time begins to think about, because I know there were some writers who were complaining about men showing too much of their thigh in public.
Yes.
Is this something that your book explores, the literature of the polemics against the overt sexuality of dress?
In some instances, yes, I do talk about that. For example, in the issue of legs, in Castiglione, there is a passage in which Castiglione talks about legs for men. And it's fascinating because you don't associate really, for legs with men, right? I mean, you associate legs with women. But now, right? So it's this idea that the men's legs were exposed, were part of the bodies, and so these legs need to be a certain, shape and so forth. And you see in the paintings. So there is a sense of there. I don't talk about la Compagnia della Casa, but this idea of relation to sexuality in some instances, in some examples. Yes, there is another point. You said, how come at certain point, men and women used to dress this, colors and all fabrics, and then there is a moment in 19th century, right? I mean, Flugel, who was he wrote a psychology of dress in the 1933. I think he published his treatises, and he was analyzing this. He called it great male renunciation. Have you heard of this definition? So he said at a certain point, with the Industrial Revolution and the fact that the bourgeois men need to appear, in public as sort of, the serious, so to speak, the one who the sense of respectability, and so the somber colors were.
The Beau Brummel as well.
But. Yeah, the black. But the black for the dandy was different, don't you think? Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, it's also the idea of the function of details in the dandy. Baudelaire talked about the tie, for example. So it's all about the tie.
The dandy is already a figure where there's the question of sexual orientation as well. So
Exactly.
the dandy is within the 19th century an exception, not the norm.
Right.
What excites me is how dress defines gender, and yet it's the signified and signifier are completely split to the extent that tights can be masculine in 1450 and feminine in 1950.
Yes.
So clearly there's nothing intrinsic about tights versus loose that signifies the masculine or the feminine. It's just almost a kind of arbitrary imposed by the system. The genders have to have something different, and these are different.
I think there's an interesting political dimension as well to the Compagnie delle Calze, in that, you know, throughout, down to about the 15th century, there's almost this kind of uniform for sober adult men of a kind of long, almost floor length or calf length gown. And then you get this very strict political differentiation by the 16th century between the remaining republics like Venice, where the patrician adult males will still wear those, you know, way after everyone's given them up, and Florence down to the end of the 15th century, and the courts where men are getting leggier and leggier. So I think it's very interesting in Venice that you have to, if you're a patrician male or even from the cittadino class, you have to adopt this kind of long medieval style toga with the sleeves, gomeo, and when you're 25 and up to that age, it's almost as though it's incumbent on you to dress in the most kind of courtly and outrageous and leggy style possible, because for the rest of your life you're actually literally not going to be able to leave the house without wearing your uniform. And I was thinking that in connection with what we were talking about earlier about the sumptuary laws. It's interesting that, you know, it's true they're pretty universal, but Venice does have a particular thing about sumptuary laws. It loves its sumptuary laws. And these are being imposed by this government that's made up of men who impose on themselves the strictest dress codes in probably the whole of Europe outside religious orders. And it's very, it seems very interesting that they're voluntarily, you know, they dress differently at home, as Vercelli points out, but, you know, in public they're adopting this code, and then they seem to be attempting to enforce this discipline on the rest of society with absolutely no success whatsoever. Very ironic situation.
Just add on to what has been said about the dominance and the predominance of the hose throughout, I think, Europe at this time, and the doublet. I think that even though you'll see there's a big difference between the tailor and how soft his doublet is, if we were looking at comparison pictures of the English, their doublet is hard and stiffened, but the doublet and the hose are the predominant masculine, I think, items of clothing. And even in Vercelli, a lot of the times, someone has a long robe on, and they have their doublet and hose underneath it. So it's sexualized, it's power, it's all kinds of things. It's fascinating. But also it's and political, as Virginia said. That company in Venice, they indicated affiliation and as well. Yeah.
Carlo. There is also another thing that regarding, you know, the leggings and all the doublet. They used to put, you know, props and stuff. Yeah, it's also in the literature. I think Ariosto talks about it in the Cassaria. So the idea to if you don't have muscular legs, you can fake them. Or if you don't, I mean, that's the idea of fashion, right? I mean, fantasia mia is also the idea that the tailor can work with your body, with your style, and then make the best of it, right? I mean, present yourself in the best. So that's the idea of fantasia mia, but it's the idea of manipulation of the body which is another important component of fashion, and what scared the moralists, what scared the church, that you can actually control. I mean, you are born with a certain body, but you can also shape it somehow. So dress can help you to shape it in a way that is more beautiful, more attractive, and so forth. And that is another tensional moment, for sumptuary laws, for moralists, but the idea that, the nature and the artifice. So that's why fashion was condemned. In the moralists, Bernardino da Siena and other preachers in the medieval ages, they talked about the devil, the fashion. So that the idea of fashion has been a dangerous element. So the idea of dress, and so.
One thing about what you're saying about them being padded, like padding the doublet and so on, what I never can understand, and even with the tailor, is that this fashion gives all the men pot bellies. Yeah. And even the little tailor, he's got a soft thing going on up here, but just over here is this little, and I assume it's for masculinity and prowess, and I'm wealthy and I can eat well. But I also often wonder whether the doublet was such a fabulously popular item of clothing because it really did conceal bodily shortcomings. It gives you a particular uniform look.
Like the armor.
Like the armor.
The shapes.
Like the armor,
yeah.
Exactly.
It makes a silhouette.
Exactly. The shape, the form. So this idea also, the tailor and the scissor, right? I mean, it's the disegno. So it's the idea that you can actually reshape, give it a form that is not necessarily belong to the way you were born with, but, make it a new, more attractive, or according to the codes and taste of the period, because that's the other thing. Women used to dye their hair blonde because blondness became very fashionable, and so it's documented in Vecellio and so many, Della Porta and so many other, right? Because blondness, but in literature, was Petrarch, Dante, they praised. Yeah. So that was the ideal beauty, blonde, being blonde. So who was not blonde was lost, needed to. So.
I think we had a very lively, spirited discussion, and I'm very grateful to Bella Mirabella and Virginia Cox for having accepted our invitation to discuss with Eugenia Paulicelli her new book. I remind you that the title is Writing Fashion in Early Modern Italy, published by Palgrave, and Ashgate, published by Ashgate. You can find it on Amazon and everywhere else books are sold. There is a great wealth of beautiful images also that accompany the book. It's also a perfect gift for the coming holiday season. Think about it. And thank you again, Eugenia, for being with us tonight. Thank you.